Please welcome Joshua Dar, Assistant Professor of Political Communication at Louisiana State University, Stephanie Grace, columnist with The Advocate, and Astead Herndon, national politics reporter with The New York Times.
All right, welcome. Thank you. It's good to see so much purple and gold in the audience, even if it's just on your lanyards. Really excited today to talk to two esteemed political reporters about the results of, was it just last week's? Yes, last week's elections. Although, depending where you live, they're still going. And so I wanted to start with an observation, which is that when a president is below 50% approval since 1946, the average loss for the president's party is 37 seats. We are on pace for Republicans to lose 38 in this cycle. So my first question is, were the 2018 midterm elections sort of a normal reaction, or were these elections noteworthy maybe for other reasons? To both of you, yeah.
I'm going to say no, not normal, because nothing these days is normal. I remember John Oliver, the comedian, said at the beginning of the Trump era, "This is not normal, remember that." And I wrote it on my refrigerator magnet. It's, this is not normal. I have to keep reminding myself, because when you're in it, it starts to feel, the numbers are normal, it's true. I think what is different, a couple things are different this time. One is the level of engagement for a midterm election, which they generally are not the things that capture the country's imaginations. Presidential elections do, and the turnout reflects that usually. Turnout was good this time, and it was, usually the energy is on the opposition side. We certainly saw that, but there was also a lot of energy on the support for the president's side. And just the way it dominated the conversation, the way it really felt like a presidential election, a national election. Even here in Louisiana, where we didn't have any contested elections, frankly, people felt like they were part of it because it's just in the ether there. And it feels like there's so much at stake. And the other reason I would say is, I think we're going to talk about this more, but I think we are seeing some signs of realignment of, patterns that have always been that are shifting some. And one of the big ones is the kind of shift to Democrats among suburban areas that are traditionally Republican. We can talk about that more, the hardening of the rural areas. And the disappearance of the middle, that I think is a really important story. The new Congress is going to have very few moderate Republicans, for example. Most of them looked around and said, I'm not running anymore. A bunch of them lost. This is both the House and the Senate. So this polarization, I think, is kind of baked in perhaps even more in this election. So.
Yeah, I'd agree that even though the electoral gains the Democrats had in this cycle might have been on par historically, that this isn't quote unquote normal. I think we should acknowledge that Democrats were up against a lot of structural disadvantages this election cycle. You have a House map that is frankly gerrymandered for them to cluster, Democratic votes in certain areas and really make it difficult for them to win some of these swing districts as they were able to win. And then on the Senate side, you had a brutal map for them where they were defending seats left and right. I think if you would have told Democrats last year, at the beginning of last year before the Roy Moore special election, where the House was 52 to 48, if you would have told them that, with this Senate map, that next year they would be at 53 or 54, they would have taken that immediately, not to mention the big gains they made on the House side. So I think that it's important to say that this isn't just a normal reaction to the president, because this is also a fairly good economy. You have a president that has a legitimate economy to run on, and we're still seeing that type of backlash, especially in suburban areas. So I do think we have some decent evidence to say that although it was not a kind of universal repudiation of the president that maybe some Democrats were looking for, it was at least a partial one, which could have big implications going forward.
Absolutely. So it's easy to talk about the sort of the aggregate gains and the differences, and like we said, when it seems like it's right on par, that can maybe mask some interesting things about it. So maybe thinking about one specific contest, which election in 2018 did you find most illustrative of our current political moment, and why? So whether it was Senate, House, governor, et cetera.
It's hard to pick just one because there's so much going on. I thought the Texas election was fascinating, the Senate election, in which obviously Ted Cruz did win, but it was very close. Beto O'Rourke made it very close. And it illustrates a couple things. One is that this expected demographic shift in Texas it's happening. We're not there yet, but it's coming. And if you look at other southwestern states, Arizona, Nevada, there's something going on there in terms of shifting these conservative states, and it's connected to demographics. It's not only that. It's also the big cities and the suburbs and all of that. But, the fact that it's almost like the path to winning is not necessarily to pull over the middle of the road voters who are already there. It's to do that, but to add all these new voters, to energize the young voters, energize your students, really, I feel like we got a glimpse of what the future of the electorate could be if people stay engaged. And, that's actually it's kind of exciting. It's kind of optimistic.
Yeah, I think there's a couple elections for me that are really predictive of ways we're going. I think we shouldn't forget about the primaries. One, I think that there was a couple races in the primaries that show where the parties are going themselves. I would say the Ayanna Pressley-Mike Capuano race out in Massachusetts where... All right, Boston then.
I'm from Boston.
Where you have folks who are really embracing the kind of progressive ideals, embracing some more kind of overt calls for representation and diversity, and ousting someone who has a decent progressive record themselves. And I think that speaks to kind of where Democrats in certain places are going. I think on the Republican side in the primary, I would pick maybe that Florida governor's primary with Ron DeSantis, who just went all in on being the Trump lookalike. And we see across the country, that is what wins Republican primaries. I mean, the biggest thing that a Republican could do in this cycle to win in the primary was get that tweet from the president, and that totally shifted the race. You would see that in data almost immediately. People who were tied became winners. People who were behind went ahead.
And he will tell you that.
And he'll tell you, he is not shy of reminding you.
Yes.
But also I would say that same thing that helps some of those folks in the primary becomes harmful in general elections, right? And if there's one general election I think is the kind of one to look at going forward, I would probably say Georgia, the governor's race there. I mean, you have Stacey Abrams kind of embodies where a lot of Democrats are going. Not only the strategy that you mentioned about engaging new people, bringing new Democrats into the fold, but also I think we've seen across the country that embracing diverse candidates and having that coupled with that progressive economic message is something that really can play well. But Brian Kemp represents where Republicans are going too. I mean, this is someone who played that kind of overt white identity politics that we've seen many Republicans lean on across the country, the caravan, the migrants, the standing for the anthem kind of playbook, but also the voter suppression, the voter, and I think that is actually where we see now in Florida, in Arizona, in Kansas, that being so central to the Republican playbook going forward.
North Dakota.
In North Dakota, right? Of the question of what the electorate will look like and who gets to shape that. I think as our country changes demographically, those questions will become more important. And so the Brian Kemps of the world will move from being, aberrations to, I think, kind of normalized.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good transition to talking about sort of voters themselves. Obviously, we'll get back to the politicians and the appeals they made, but I think probably a lot of people in this room recognize something of what's called a town gown divide, or maybe they're a center of thinking of one way when they're in a rural community, or something with the university and its surroundings are perhaps mismatched politically. And so I think it's important for us to talk about sort of what it means to these geographic shifts that we saw. And so I'm just curious, I mean, as a way to get into this question, is there any Republican argument that can appeal to suburban voters while Trump is in office? And conversely, what can Democrats say to rural voters to possibly win back some of those votes they've lost?
I mean, I'll say this. So, like, you see Republicans try different strategies here. You have the Mark Sanfords of the world who will try to be the anti-Trump Republican, but they lose in the primary, right? Because that can't win you. You can't there's really not a home for those people currently. And then you have some people like John Faso in upstate New York who tried to run in a swing district as didn't really talk about the tax cut or health care or anything like that, but tried to brand his opponent who was black as, a big city other rapper, right? Because he had this like old rap career. It was kind of a long story. And he lost too, right? And you have people in these in these districts, the anti-Trump energy is really real. And I don't know if we see coming out of Tuesday a clear strategy for Republicans in winning those people back under this president.
Just wait it out. Maybe.
I think it's part of the realignment that may be happening, right? I mean, the good news for Republicans is in these rural areas, they're not only seeing people, still supportive of the president, but they are continuing to turn out in larger numbers. And so in things like the Senate, that's great for them, right? Like in places like Ohio, Democrats are having the same, are seeing, ghost because they cannot match the energy that Trump has in those outer, in those rural, outer borough areas with, urban folks aren't coming out. So I would say that it's unclear whether Republicans can make those arguments to win those people back. But right now, what they're betting on is that the coalition of Trump really helps in Senate elections and helps in a presidential election. And they may be willing to cede the House to make those two things happen.
I think it's very difficult. I guess my kind of overarching sense right now, and this is not new to this cycle, this is something that's been happening for a while, is that congressional elections are national elections. People vote DR, and what they're doing, they're not even necessarily looking at the person they're voting on. They're looking at the top of the ticket. They're looking at who the president is, and will that president have support of Congress, or will Congress be oppositional? Here in Louisiana, we've had a lot of races like this. There's a guy named David Vitter who was in the Senate for a long time. He was, in 2007, Family Values Republican, had a prostitution scandal, okay? You'd think his career would be over. 2010, he's on the ballot in the big Tea Party year. Obama, 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 Obama. That was his campaign, and he ran against a very moderate Democrat, and he killed him because it was a referendum on Obama. He turned it into that, and I think we see that. I wrote about a race in Rhode Island years ago, 2006, and Lincoln Chafee, remember him? Who's now a Democrat, was an independent. Before that, he was a very, very, basically liberal Republican, old school New England Republican, anti-war and pro-choice and environmental, all those things. He was very popular in a Democratic state, and he was running against Sheldon Whitehouse, who's now in the Senate. And it was a fascinating race because people loved Lincoln Chafee, yet they were not going to vote for him because they wanted to rebuke George Bush. And they came up, I was out campaigning, and people would come up and apologize to him for voting against him. And he would basically look at them and say, I understand, that's the way it is now. And it's becoming much more so, and certainly when control of one of the houses are at stake, it's the reason we're seeing Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and all these ads. That said, I think there's kind of an interesting case study in Louisiana here that I'll tell you a little about. And one of the reasons I think it works for this guy is that he's a governor, he's not in Washington. So it's not about this national balance of power. But this is a Republican state, we have a Democratic governor, and he's pretty popular. I think he has a good chance of getting reelected next year. One of the things he's done is, he's a rural guy, he went to West Point. He stated early on, I am pro-gun, I am anti-abortion, off the table. So but yet he's very progressive on other things. He's very progressive economically, wants to raise the minimum wage, very pro-LGBT rights. Other things that you think would be anathema in a conservative state, not necessarily, but there is this cultural familiarity he is able to establish with voters. And that kind of shows, I think, that and we've seen in some of these referenda around the country where even conservative voters voted for pretty progressive issues when it wasn't about D versus R, that maybe these things that we think are very divisive aren't necessarily divisive. You just have to kind of figure out which the divisive ones are, I guess.
Yeah, and there are individual politicians who overcome this problem, right? You have your Charlie Baker's in Massachusetts, who even as
Also
Elizabeth
governor.
Warren
Yeah.
is getting elected, he can get elected. You have Sherrod Brown in Ohio, who even as Democrats are getting slaughtered, is overwhelmingly winning re-election. Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, who is winning as a Democrat, even as that state is moving a different direction. So you do have individuals who are able, because of their kind of force of personality and their like rapport in the state, to overcome these waves. But that's very difficult in the House because you know, you usually aren't able to establish your kind of brand outside of the president and the party.
So I think, the governor's races, that's an interesting point. They show us that it is possible, and maybe it is just the force of personality of individual people, but I found it interesting, for example, in Ohio, the same people who'd voted for Sherrod Brown over Mike DeWine in 2006 were voting for Sherrod Brown and Mike DeWine in 2018. And you know, whether it's the Klobuchar and Republican voters or the you know, the Warren Baker voters, it'll be interesting to see going forward whether it is just these individual one-off people or whether there is some formula there where, and maybe it's just governor's offices generally, where politicians can sort of avoid some of these nationalizing dynamics that are overwhelming most of the other races in politics.
One more note about Charlie Baker. Not only is he easily reelected in Massachusetts, he's the most popular governor in the country in a Democratic state as a Republican. Probably the second is Larry Hogan in Maryland, another Republican in a Democratic state. There's something going on there.
Yeah. I mean, I think these are interesting questions. I mean, I always caution folks, as someone who spends a lot of time talking to Trump voters, that it's important to remember that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and that, you know, the narrative that comes out of that nothing sticks to him, that he's kind of, you know, indestructible is a false one. I mean,
12-dimensional chess argument.
Yeah, that this is like some grand strategist who voters are unwilling to break from is not one that we really know is true yet. What we know is that, I mean, we know that he lost a popular vote, right? We should say that, but like we also know that in these states that were that decided the Electoral College, a lot of those were binary, I mean, these were binary choices with Hillary Clinton, and a lot of those Michigan voters, those same ones that after 2016 were questioning if they would vote for a woman, just put Gretchen Whitmer in the governor's mansion. You know, a lot of those people in Pennsylvania who we thought may have been gone for Democrats forever, just elected a, you know, majority Democratic, all Democratic congressional slate and a Democratic governor overwhelmingly. So we don't know yet how crystallized this Trump coalition is. We do know that a part of it, though, does seem to be lasting.
So yeah, the suburban voters were certainly, I think, part of that Trump coalition in 2016. He maybe didn't do as well as other Republicans, but it was not the revolt against him that we saw in this year. So, you know, I think we've sort of addressed some of Trump's effect on these people, but is it likely to go on past him? Can Republicans count on them coming back into the fold, or was this really a realigning election, particularly in the suburbs? I think rural voters have the same question from the other direction. But you know, I read your Gretchen Whitmer article with great interest. Has Trump lost some of those suburban voters that he may have had more appeal with in 2016, and can Republicans get them back ever?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is situational. You know, I try not to make kind of like, you know, they're lost forever, they're not lost forever. I think it's going to greatly depend on, you know, what this 2020 matchup is.
What's the choice?
I will say this, though. I think that Trump has so wedded the Republican Party to this kind of brand of identity, white identity-driven politics that I don't think that is going anywhere, right? The caravan of 3 weeks ago, there will be a caravan of 2020, right? Like there will be, because that is who he is and that's what he does. Right. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And I think sometimes we think that, oh, you know, this is just another example of Trump and Republicans kind of employing this when it's politically necessary. You know, this has been the consistent theme from the second he announced his presidency to today, and we should expect that to be a consistent thing till the existence of his political career. And so while we don't know whether people will vote for it again. We don't know if people in the presence of someone like an Elizabeth Warren or someone like another 2020 figure will make that same choice that they did previously. What we can expect is that the Trump playbook doesn't change, and they will come back to those same suburban communities, not only pitching the economy and all of those things, but pitching that the black and brown people are coming from the border and they're gonna fundamentally change our culture, which we should say was not just a Trump-specific pitch, but was across Republicans. I think people truly underrate how much the Caravan, Colin Kaepernick appeared in so many NRCC and Republican ads across America, in places that were overwhelmingly white districts, in places that did not have any immigrants. This was the dominant narrative of the party kind of nationwide, and I think we can expect that to be true going forward.
And then the question specifically.
Yeah, I probably didn't.
No, it's okay.
No,
I will go back. I have a lot to say about that.
It was a continuation of talking about Republican losses in the
Right.
suburbs, because those were specifically the districts that were hollowed out.
I think that's absolutely true. This is Trump's game. It's what gives him energy. It's what gives his base energy. The question is how the suburban voters react to the base, almost.
Right.
There's a guy named Brad Todd who's a political consultant. He worked here a lot in Louisiana. He handled Josh Hawley in Missouri, who just beat Claire McCaskill for the Senate. I read a quote from him this morning. Republicans are starting to lament this. Lindsey Graham has said, we have to get suburban women back. They recognize they have a problem. They're trying to figure out what to do about it. What he said is, it's just Trump. It's just the tone. Once he's gone, we're okay, seemed to be his attitude. I don't know about that. Again, that is something that does remain to be seen, but the kind of the mean-spiritedness, I think the lack of just politeness and sticking to norms and all of that really plays badly among suburban people, and specifically suburban women. And I'm going to say, I think the Republican Party has a much bigger problem with women than just Donald Trump. I think we saw it in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings when there was this wall of men who had to outsource their questioning to a woman because there are no women on the Judiciary Committee on the Republican side, 4 on the Democratic side. There are plenty of Republican female senators, and then Mitch McConnell makes it worse by saying, well, it's a lot of hard work being on the Judiciary, nobody wants to do it. Sorry, no. And just this overall tone, and it's the tone, it's the language, it's the, everything with Trump, plus I think what could happen with the courts and Roe v. Wade, what is happening with access to birth control, health care, when there are these pictures of a room full of 24 men talking about whether women can have access to women's health care. It cuts pretty deep, I think. And I think there are a lot of people of all ages, people who fought the first feminist battles and people who never thought they would have to, who just took all of these things, the world they were born into for granted, who see that they can't. And, it's the thing that's energizing the Women's March and all of these new women in Congress, and I think that's a storyline going forward.
Yeah. So that was a wonderful discussion on voters, and we'll see what ends up happening. When it comes to, I want to shift a little bit into policy, because there were a lot of policies on the ballot as well last week. And I wanted to sort of explore a little bit some of the seeming mismatches between the policies that were elected and the people that were elected. There were a lot of victories for progressive legislation in deep red states, such as the restoration of voting rights to felons in Florida, Medicaid expansion in Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah, minimum wage increases in Arkansas and Missouri, at the same time that Republican candidates are winning in those states. So how do we make sense of this going forward from a policy perspective?
I would say there's no D or R attached to those policies. That's the first thing to look at.
Yep.
And that's something I was talking to my dad who lives in Florida the other day. He was like, what's going on down there? And he said there was no D or R on this felon ballot. People looked at it on the basis of the issue. And again, criminal justice reform we had a big criminal justice reform question here too in Louisiana that won overwhelmingly with Democrat Republican support. And this is to require criminal convictions to be based on unanimous juries, because that was not the case in Louisiana until now. But it's the same coalition. It's the same coalition that's working on prison reform. If you look in Congress, you have Rand Paul working with Democrats. It's the thing that kind of has, and I think it's instructive because you can come at it from different places. You can come at it from the real social justice place. You can look at it in terms of racial disparities and effects on community, but you could also look at it in how much government spends locking people up. And so, you have a liberal argument, a conservative argument, but what I've found in all of these issues is people don't necessarily, believe one and not the other. They can believe both. So, can we get there with other issues? I think minimum wage is one of those too. It's something that is, again, I found here in Louisiana, it has not been a deal killer for our Democratic governor in a Republican state. He hasn't gotten it through the legislature because it's a very business-controlled legislature, but the voters are fine with it, again, even though they pretty much vote straight Republican. There is I think we're the traditional elite national Republican issues, the tax cuts, the small government, that's not necessarily where the voters are. I think they care more about a safety net. I think it doesn't necessarily resonate with the lives people live and the communities people live in. It's just that these cultural issues kind of take over. Other issues kind of dictate their votes maybe. So when you separate them out, you do see some pretty progressive votes in unexpected places. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a real kind of bipartisan consensus around criminal justice reform pre-Trump, which I think still exists among voters, and why things like the voting restoration of felons in Florida happens. And I think that partisan coalition kind of still exists. It's just kind of stymied because the president and until a couple weeks ago, the attorney general wouldn't hear him out, right? And so I think that on the ground, that bipartisan consensus still exists. With healthcare, look, I mean, the attempts for Republicans to repeal totally flip-flopped the popularity of, obviously, Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, and also surged popularity for things like Medicare for All and Medicaid expansion. And so you had in this cycle Republican lawmakers who were engaged in lawsuits to reverse the Affordable Care Act, running ads saying that they would protect people with pre-existing conditions. You had Republican governors who had long stood against things like Medicaid expansion, scrambling to find a way to say that they would do it in the next term. And that's because there was a real kind of grassroots effort last year, which frankly, even though Republicans had the votes to repeal Obamacare, stopped them from being able to do so. And so I think now you're seeing the after effects of that, where those policies, especially Medicaid expansion, are super popular. When the states were able to do that for the first time, there was such a negative energy around working with Obama in the Republican Party for a variety of reasons, that it was more popular for those governors to say, we're going to not do this for the pure appearance of looking like we're working with someone who's such a political pariah among our base. That no longer exists anymore. And I think what you're saying is right. When you strip the issues from the partisan consensus around them, then you have a different opportunity for people to create coalitions.
Right. And one more thing I guess I'd add about Medicaid expansion is it's a big issue in rural areas too, because it affects funding of rural hospitals, a lot of which are in real trouble in places that have not expanded it. So it's, again, you're getting different coalitions and maybe unexpected coalitions, but
sort of a cross-cutting thing. Yeah, exactly. When it comes to policy, I think we're going to be back in a place where states are going to become more important. Are there any Minnesotans here? Your state is now the only one with a divided legislature in the country, which is the first time since 1914 that we've had that few. So under nationally divided government, should we expect more policymaking to fall to the states? And if so, what kind of sort of laboratories of democracy to innovation kind of policies might we expect from state government? We saw a lot of it after 2010.
I think that's probably the only place where things are going to happen. I think we can just write it off. Washington's going to do absolutely nothing. They didn't do anything when it was all Republicans. Right. So we can really just write it off now. I think there will be a lot of innovation driven from states. We've seen Democrats make big advancements in state legislatures on Tuesday, and that came with a mandate to do some of these things. And So I think that we can expect, I know I was just in Michigan for election night, and that's a place that had such a tight Republican supermajority in the Senate, which has now been rolled back. So things like right to work are being talked about, being looked at. Things like, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I mean, those are probably going to happen at a statewide level because, Washington's just
got to happen somewhere.
Yeah, it's a no-go.
I would add, I think gerrymandering to that, because that's something that is a national conversation, problem, issue, but is being addressed in some states and not others. There was just a referendum in Michigan to create a kind of nonpartisan way of dividing up districts. And this is one of the things that creates this intense division in Washington. So one way to address it is at the state level, and there are certainly people trying in a lot of states. Back to healthcare, now that it looks like the Affordable Care Act will stand, maybe this is less important, but when it was really at risk, there was a really interesting coalition of, again, governors, Democrats, Republicans. John Kasich led it, Ohio, and John Hickenlooper from Colorado, so a Democrat and a Republican. Charlie Baker was involved, my governor, John Bel Edwards. Again, the moderate governors from both sides. But they were writing to Washington saying, look, we know there are problems here. Here's what we're dealing with on the state level. Here on the ground, these are our problems. Here are some ideas to fix it. Come on, guys, we can do this. There is common ground. And really, again, getting no hearing at all in Washington. But, there are relationships even among governors where I think people are trying to be problem solvers. And, I hope that continues.
Yeah. What do you think will be the greatest policy consequence of these 2018 elections? And nothing could be an answer. Not doing anything when we could be doing something. Yes. Negative policy.
I mean, I think the biggest impact is going to be rhetorical. I mean, I think we're going to enter a really new, the ideological range in Washington has expanded greatly. I mean, you have the most progressive members of Congress, the most vocal and outspoken members of Congress, who are going to really rattle the Democratic caucus. You have a death of a Trump wing of Republicans that will empower folks like the Freedom Caucus to move from just being fringe, but I mean, folks like Jim Jordan might be the whole leader of the minority. He might become the new House Minority Leader. And so while that has I think the impact on policy might be very little, what I think was a tone that we would probably all describe as nasty in Washington for the last 2 years it may reach levels unseen so far.
The last 2 years might have been the calm times.
Yeah, I think we might look back and think that the last 2 years were pretty chill.
Yeah.
Wow.
I agree with that.
Well, one thing that will happen, I think, is this kind of march towards stacking the courts with conservatives. Young conservatives will be there for a very long time. Will continue because that only has to go through the Senate.
Right.
So that's off the table for Democrats, and that's something that's really one of the reasons a lot of these Republicans who you'd think might stand up to Trump on some things and have not, they're getting what they want on there, and it's going to last for our lifetimes. Beyond that, one thing I think that's probably, I don't think much will get done. I'm interested to watch Nancy Pelosi, assuming she will be Speaker, and Donald Trump, because he is so transactional, and I think she really kind of has his number and, is good at making demands, what deals they cut, and then where Mitch McConnell is and all of that, I think is going to be a really interesting kind of three-way dance.
And that was my next question, was what do you think the Pelosi-Trump relationship might be like?
Yeah, I think, I do agree with you that I think she is someone who has a pretty good relationship with him from all reports in Washington and can deal kind of with his personality. I think the problem for Pelosi lies in her caucus. And if it was the caucus that just exited, the current one, I think she would have much more leeway to, do the transactional Washington kind of games as previously. The base is not there anymore. I mean, the base is with the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world. And there is a real, I should say that's not true universally across the country, but I think a lot of where the biggest energy is with those people. And so there is going to be a really high bar for working with him on any level. And I think that Speaker Pelosi will, assuming she wins, which I think she will, it will be difficult for her. I don't think our hardest challenge is going to be Donald Trump. I think our hardest challenge is going to be her own Democrats.
That will be tough to navigate. Is there any one thing that's possible, like infrastructure, prescription drugs, prices, DACA, anything where there might be at least a sort of an effort from Democrats to see if Trump will take the bait on making policy with them, or is it just all sort of swept away when the investigations inevitably begin?
I think they would love infrastructure, and the problem again is going to be the Senate, because Trump wants to do infrastructure. How many times have we had Infrastructure Week where they announced and then it evolved into some sort of scandal? But part of his problem was infrastructure is government spending, right? And he's got this conservative Republican caucus. And he had this idea that we could do it all, we could just get the private sector to do it, and it would end up being this giant giveaway to corporate America, and the Democrats aren't going to go for that. But so, one question is, can Nancy Pelosi kind of cut a really good deal so that he gets to say he did infrastructure and it really is a government spending program, and can they get that through the Senate? As I said, with really fewer senators in the middle, with fewer senators who have incentive to crossover. I mean, John McCain is gone. Susan Collins, after the Kavanaugh thing, I think she's maybe not a little sidelined. Lisa Murkowski is right. She's the independent. I don't know that Jeff Flake is gone, who never really voted the way he talked, but he talked. I mean, he would make, tweet out, "I'm so upset about what the president did," and then 20,000 people would say, "Do something," and he wouldn't. But so he's now replaced by a Democrat. But the Republicans still have the majority, and I don't know who breaks from that.
Yeah, I think that it's hard. I mean, something like infrastructure would be the likely, right? Something like, and so the problem there is which Donald Trump shows up, right? If it's a transactional deal making, I do think there's a window of opportunity there, but I can't see the kind of hyper-conservative, fiscal hawky wing going for him, and I can't see him overriding them with Democratic support. That's just something we haven't seen him, for all the talk of, art of the deal, be willing to do yet. So I think that's the coalition that would have to arise for that set things to happen, and I'm not sure that happens. I would say the issue that there is bipartisan consensus on is opioids and opioid addiction. There is a pretty good recognition across the aisle that there has not been enough federal investment on the crisis, and that is something that's hitting people's districts across states. So if I had to pick an issue, it would be that. I think you mentioned DACA. No,
it was on my. As I was reading it, I thought it was.
Because then you have he brings in the wall, he brings in the.
I mean, that's what he has, immigration to talk.
Democrats aren't going to bring that up unprompted.
Right, and so then that launches the same fights that were 2016, 2018, and what will be 2020. Opioids, I think, is the one issue that actually insulates all parties from some of these problems, and is something I would bet on them.
And there has been bipartisan legislation, even in this Congress,
right.
Even though Trump stood up and said we did it with no Democratic support, they did it with universal Democratic support.
Yep.
So yes, absolutely.
Great. So I want to have some time for questions, but I wouldn't be doing my moderator duty if I didn't start some 2020 speculation up here. And so if you had to take one guess right now, who is the 2020 Democratic nominee for president? Just 'cause I feel like I have to do this.
I mean, I think if we learned, something from 2016, it's the prediction game is bad. I think, I would say themes that I think are going to be really important. I think, there was so much talk coming out of Tuesday about whether it was the moderate wing won, and there was a sign that you had to nominate the Joe Biden, Sherrod Brown, kind of like, responsible white guy wing of the Democratic Party, or you had to nominate the more like fiery progressive type. And I think that fight isn't clearly settled. And I think what you have I think both of those sides on Tuesday were looking for a clear message and a mandate for their kind of wing. I think they both can take positive and negatives from it, which basically means we're going to get 25 people. We're going to get 25 people who all think that the country is ready for them. And like 24 and a half of them are going to be very wrong, right? And so we just don't know yet. I think that there will be some interesting things. You have multiple really qualified minorities running, right? And so in the Democratic primary, where black and brown older voters are such a key constituency, where those people fall, do they coalesce around a single candidate, is going to be a huge initial question. The kind of Bernie wing, right? Like, what is the next iteration for those people? Bernie Sanders would have been the Democratic nominee if he could have gotten those minority supporters. Can someone take his message and really apply it to those groups? Really talk about things like racial justice in a better way than I think Sanders did in 2016, or talk about inequality in a better way, and win places like South Carolina and Georgia and California? That's going to be a huge question. And we've seen women candidates perform so much better than men in the primaries and in the general election this year. Can someone like Joe Biden overcome Anita Hill and overcome those type of issues? And is the party just ready to kind of, I've talked to so many voters who see 2020 as a way to kind of like right the wrong of Hillary Clinton and what they think was a real injustice that they did to her. And so I think that there's going to be some energy around like, we want a woman. Where that all falls, I have no idea.
Right. And I think there is absolutely that we want a woman energy, but I think there's also this fear. Look at the misogyny that was there that we did not realize was as deep as it was. And if the goal is just to beat this guy, is it safer to not say, at some point in the future, but not this time? And I think that's maybe some of the energy behind. There's a little buzz about our former mayor here in New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, who again is a very progressive Southern white male. I don't know how that shakes out. The caution versus the hope and the excitement and the go for it. One compromise, I think, which could happen, Joe Biden would run one term and Kamala Harris would be his running mate, and he's kind of setting her up as the front runner the next time. That's a scenario. But that said, we've had so many people who've even had their moment and it's already passed and we're 2 years out. Sherrod Brown is having a moment now because he did so well in Ohio. He outperformed, in a Republican state, and kind of looking, okay, he had an economic populist message. Maybe that's the way to go. In a couple of weeks, it could be somebody else.
I think in my mind, I kind of see it. There's the populist progressive wing of Democrats who have come out and kind of made their name on progressive economic policy. And there's the people who have the ceiling of the Obama coalition. Maybe they are people of color, or they speak to kind of like the idealism of the country. The winner, in my mind, is someone who bridges those gaps. And I think that can be someone like Senator Harris talking about economic issues more openly than I think she has already. It could be someone like Elizabeth Warren making inroads to communities of color, or someone like Sherrod Brown doing so. We'll know, though, when those two kind of separate lanes start converging, who is really making kind of electoral.
Right. And then another question is generational, I think, that we have this group of people, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, who are 60s, 70s, and have Nancy Pelosi, if you look at the House and the House leadership, who've just dominated the Democratic Party for so long that people, younger people kind of haven't gotten a lot of oxygen or chance to kind of grow into leadership roles. And I think there's a lot of frustration with that and how we see that expressed too.
Can I say one more thing on this?
Absolutely.
None of the above still polls ahead of the field, right? So there's still a lot of energy for, I shouldn't even say the name, for the Beto O'Rourke, out of nowhere, come, up from nothing type of thing. And I think we shouldn't discount the idea that maybe the 2020er that is actually going to emerge, the person who can merge both of those coalitions, is someone who has not been on the national stage for, for even a year so far. Because I do think there's new energy that's happening right now, and who speaks to that the best could be, could be someone who lost on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, there's advantages in being a blank slate in some ways.
Yeah.
All
And
right,
having
so
a good narrative, I think that's really important.
Yes.
Presidential races are about a narrative, so look for that.
I agree. We've got about 20 minutes left. I want to be sure there's time for audience questions. There's 2 microphones in the front on either side and 2 in the back on either side. So whomever gets
Hi,
there first.
Cass Mosley from the University of Oregon. I wanted to take us back to the
see where
election night
anybody- okay.
question. Hi, sorry.
The speaker's right here, right? Okay.
As we started to watch the election returns early in the evening, it didn't seem like it was going to be that great for the Democrats. As the elections, the polls closed further and further west, it got better and better for the Democrats. And then actually, subsequently, it's gotten even better. And I guess I wanted to push then, because you haven't really talked about it, is the regional differences that seem to be emerging. I think in addition to the wins of Democrats in Arizona and Nevada, Romney is actually fairly moderate in Utah. And then in the House races, in the rural West, where in many places Republicans still won, they didn't actually just sort of skate to the finish line with no opposition. And so I guess and that's sort of a very different story than we've been seeing in the Midwest and South. And so my question is am I imagining this, or is there a Western Southern divide emerging or re-emerging that we really need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that what could, the Democratic thought going into 2016 was that their future went through Georgia and Texas changing. And I think what we could be seeing now is that it could be going through the West and like reclaiming some of the Midwest, right? So in 2018, you have them making gains in Michigan, Pennsylvania, but you have them, really outperforming in Nevada. You have Colorado. Obviously, Colorado has moved from being kind of a swing state to kind of like solidly Democrat. And then you have the results now from Arizona, which might get even better come a presidential year. So I think certainly that's a great point to hit on, because the West does seem at least somewhat more resistant to this. Western Republicans are, Martha McSally tried to, ride the caravan wave into the Senate, and it seems like that's something at least there was a bigger backlash to, or maybe some Republicans rejected. So for Democrats, I think that's actually the biggest bright spot, is that you might not be as reliant on the Floridas of the world as you once were, if they can start making that kind of Western swing a more permanent one.
An interesting kind of sub-note on that is, like, these are states that have a lot of immigration, right? That are maybe a little less susceptible to the caravan, the demonizing, the kind of scare tactics. I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, maybe just lived experience. People who live on the border, talk about what it actually is like versus what they see on national TV.
Absolutely. I'm here in the front.
Kevin Carmen, University of Nevada, Reno. I wonder if you could speculate on whether you feel like anybody on the Republican side will challenge President Trump for the presidency in 2020.
Yeah, I wrote about this some months ago. I mean, I think we will continue to see speculation, and there is room for someone to kind of have an ego run. I say that because if there's anything we've learned from this cycle, is that Republicans are still very much with Donald Trump. So I don't think there's actually a clear electoral lane for that person, but what there is money, and there is a kind of personality branding. I want to stand up in history as the Republican who said this wasn't acceptable. So I think, the ones who have been speculated, obviously, are the Jeff Flakes, are John Kasich, and others. And I think they will continue to be speculated. They're fueling some of those speculations themselves. Do they have enough voters? 2018, 2016 point to no.
I agree. I think John Kasich, boy, does he want to, from what I can see. And he wants to be that guy. He wants to be the guy that saved the Republican Party from itself, that kind of reclaimed its moral authority. He kind of wanted to do that when he was running in the primaries last time, and remember, he didn't do so well. He was probably more popular among non-Republicans for that than Republicans. So again, Republican primary voters are very, very conservative, and it's a tough jump to make from the primary to the general.
In the back.
David Goldston from MIT. One policy thing, one political. So on the policy side, one thing that Congress is going to have to do is the normal work of, once normal, work of spending bills.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a huge issue there about whether the spending caps will be raised or not, which
Yep.
is very important for this group. Can argue either way, but I'm just, so on the political policy side, I'm wondering if you have a sense of how the various election realignments, what that'll mean for spending bills, both in the lame duck and next year. And then the political question is, I saw an interesting article that said, you know, Trump got 46% of the vote in 2016, and Republicans across the full Republican vote in 2018 was also 46%. So that there are obviously shifts about where, but in terms of the overall sense of where voters are, it hasn't shifted at all. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. So spending policy and how much the aggregate vote has actually shifted.
To the second point, I would say Republicans usually have a better share of midterm voters than they do presidential ones because Democratic voters are usually the most or more infrequent or minorities, young people who only tend to come out 4 years. So it's actually bad for Republicans that that number has not increased and speaks to how Democrats really changed the electorate this cycle, that they can actually keep Republicans at bay. To the first point about spending, I think that is, you're right, that is a huge question a policy question that will have to be decided. It is, it's just unclear kind of where it's going because it's unclear kind of what the Democratic strategy will be here. There's been some speculation early that they will try to kind of force feed some of their, favorites into that spending bill. Things like, increased election protections, or and if that happens, things like DACA, right? Like if that happens, kind of all bets are off there. I do think Republicans, they've feigned like they cared about the national deficit for so long. They clearly in the last couple of years, they were willing to let go of some of those concerns. Do those concerns come back on the Republican side now that there's a Democratic House? Probably, but maybe not. And how both of those sides kind of strategy-wise decide, I think, leads us to, is going to get the answer to that question. I think it's a little too early to know right now.
Right. And then another question is, how much they kind of blocked themselves in by passing this giant tax cut that will increase the deficit that, will him spending in for decades to come, probably. But the 46% is interesting. This is something that I think is going to be a huge issue going forward and should be now. 46%, not 50%, right? Donald Trump elected to the presidency with less than, even though he lost the popular vote. Same with George W. Bush the first time. It's happened twice, the last two presidents. Congress, in the Senate, in the House, normally there are more people who vote for Democrats, yet there are all these structural things happening that favor Republicans, and the voter suppression, and what's happening at the fact that kind of access to the ballot has become a partisan tool almost in modern culture. And, I really worry that, maybe less so now that the Democrats have the House, but how many times can this happen before people really start to lose this thing that we need in this country for it to function, which is for results to be legitimate and for people to, when they lose, accept that it was a fair election and we go forward. And with everything going on in Florida, I keep thinking of Al Gore when he stood up there after the Supreme Court ruled and said, I don't agree, but I accept it. And that was a signal to his people, to his supporters, he is the president, he is our president, we go forward. I think it's exacerbated it that many times there have been very close elections, and yet the group that ended up in power has acted as if they had a mandate when they didn't. And that, so I worry that we kind of are at this point where we really could have a crisis of legitimacy of our system. And if people don't feel like the results are fair, if people say in Georgia don't feel like Brian Kemp is their legitimately elected governor, what happens? And that scares me, kind of as a country, and I don't know what we do about it, but here we are.
Here in the front.
Good morning. Pedro Martinez, Central State in Ohio. I just wanted to make a comment and then a question about women not only were women, but first-time women. The first black woman in Georgia running for governor. The LGTB. We had the youngest women running for 29 and 30 years old. And then bringing those figures into my question is the women that were elected that were Muslims, especially in the areas that gave Donald Trump the vote. So if we figure that 80,000 sort of votes won the Electoral College for Donald Trump, and you look at what is happening in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and so those states that were significant in making that impact on the election, do you foresee now political parties looking at predictability of votes and how they can figure out what areas in this country might bring the presidency based on the votes that they can get from those areas? So I think it's significant, especially when one of those states has flipped into the blue side, and then you have women being elected that are not necessarily in the Trump camp.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, I was in Detroit when Rashida Tlaib won the primary and spent some time with her. And this is a new type of politician. I mean, obviously there's a demographic stuff that I think you hit on and I think is important, but they're actually, just the way they go about politics is differently. The communities they're listening to are different, and they're about to bring all of those experiences and to Washington. And that's when I talk about the change of the Democratic caucus. I think it's through people like Ilhan Omar in Minnesota and Tlaib in Michigan and Ayanna Pressley in Boston, Lauren Underwood in Illinois. I think that's a few, I mean, those people come from very different districts. You know, Detroit, and where Tlaib is elected, is a heavily Democratic district. Lauren Underwood's winning in a heavily Republican one. But what we are seeing is there is something to women, particularly women of color, bringing that progressive message to other people that might be, you know, the Democratic future of electability.
And it's so overdue. I mean, I'm thinking back to the conversation about the Alabama Senate race, and, you know, that was African-American women who put Doug Jones in the Senate, and they, this has happened here too in a lot of southern states, I think. You know, African-American voters have been the solid Democratic voters, and yet for years they were asked to support a Republican light because that person could win statewide, could win in a conservative area. You know, someone who was not like them, who didn't necessarily share their agenda, and that, I think there's justifiably a lot of frustration in always being the one who supports someone who is maybe a little less, you know, the lesser of two evils or whatever, and not being the person and not having their agenda be front and center. And it's just, you know, I think back to Obama, I think of all the little kids, the way they responded to Barack Obama as president, just this idea that someone like me can do that, how incredibly strong that is. And to have that in all these different communities, different types of communities around the country, I think is going to be incredibly powerful. And, you know, talking about women, I would add, you know, the veterans, you know. There are there are going to be women veterans, there are women who've had gun violence in their families, there are all kinds of people who are bringing all of these experiences as first-time candidates, as people who didn't necessarily groom themselves to be politicians, but are bringing their life experience to Congress. I think it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, right here in the front.
Thank you. Adel Shir Mohammadi, University of Maryland. According to New York Times, about top 1% of our nation holds 38% of privately owned wealth. And bottom 90% basically owns 73% of the debt, nation's debt. So distractions from my point of view, and campaign financing and all the issues, distractions that is happening is one party, let's say President Trump says invaders are coming for the migrants, and so all of a sudden it is along, you know, the international invaders, and then internally it is the race issues that has been raised, the nationalism, and so on and so forth. It's really our middle class and working class in the United States who are really basically owning most of that debt. Where is that dialogue taking place whenever whatever candidate talks about national health, all of a sudden it is labeled as social democracy, it is evil, and so forth. It doesn't go there. So therefore, lots of times, middle class and working class who need that and need actually to make some progress in economic opportunity and that exists in this nation, they really sometimes vote against their own, basically, class and their own benefits or opportunity. Dialogue that,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, this is essentially the Obama argument that he's been making over this summer, and I think it's kind of a preview to the Democratic argument you're going to see in 2020, that the Trump's leaning on divisive, what you want to call it, bigoted, or racist messaging is actually the distraction for them looting the middle class and looting the working class and pointing to things like the tax cut and changing social safety net programs and the like. I think that's actually going to be what a really big point of emphasis for Democrats in 2020, because they want to both acknowledge the identity-driven stuff that Trump is doing and kind of morally stand against it, but they want to center the kind of economic theft in their mind of it all as front and center to their political message. But what one thing that, talking to Trump, Trump voters and the like, it's funny because people always use the term of voting against their own interest and point to working class, economic policy. But you can't separate racial interest from economic ones as well. Some people are voting because they see a country that they believe is going to strip them of a racial hierarchy that has long benefited them, and they see that as just as much as their interest as something like a social safety net, right? And so you have kind of these dual interests, which may seem in conflict, but some voters don't see it like that. I mean, they think their primary concern is, reclaiming their country, is sticking it to the NFL players who are kneeling. And if I've talked to people whose healthcare premiums were going up at the same time and asked them, isn't this thing more important? And that's not always true to them.
I think, I think there's a reason the good economy argument did not work very well this time and did not work very well, frankly, in 2016. And that's that it's not just the economy, it's your economy, right? It is the very wealthy are doing very well, the people in big cities often doing very well, and, even 2016, you heard Democrats talk globalism and trade, and it's all good, and it works out, and here are the metrics, and meanwhile there's the person living in the factory town that is closed and has no opportunity, and and the tax cut certainly, a lot of people got a little tax cut, but a lot of people who didn't necessarily need it got a big tax cut, and people do see that, and the little tax cut doesn't really change their circumstance because we have gotten so out of whack with the income inequality, and it's really coming home to roost. You talked about, I don't know where you are, but you talked about debt. It's so interesting to me how much of a conversation on the ground student debt is and how little of a conversation it is at the congressional level. And almost just this kind of not recognizing how debilitating it is to a generation of people and how it's keeping them from, buying homes and having families and, just the long-term implications of this. The kind of not having the prospect of the economic stability that their parents had and the wage growth and all of this. And I think this is another chicken that is really going to come home to roost, and maybe it's the reason these minimum wage things are passing in conservative places. Certainly behind Bernie, I think. Medicare for all of that.
So one more quick one.
Yeah, Mike Boehm, I'm from the University of Nebraska, but I've lived in Ohio and Illinois and Oregon. First generation college student, spent 21 years in the military. So I was curious by the conversation about Medicaid expansion in Nebraska. You mentioned that. Mm-hmm. And I just happened to pull from the Omaha World Herald article entitled "People Need It versus People Who Don't Want to Help Themselves." And in here, there's a map that of the 93 counties in Nebraska, 85 of those counties voted against Medicaid expansion. 8 voted for Medicaid expansion. 3 counties had more than 20%, and they were the populous counties in favor for. 35 counties had votes of 20% or more of the vote saying do not extend Medicaid expansion. So I think all politics is local, and I guess my point here, I appreciate the panel, that those of us in the academy that are working with maps that look like this really have to think hard about maintaining our objectivity, our evidence-based practice, and really the art of the compromise, and focusing on these massive issues that just are changing and shaping not only America, our states, but the world. And I guess it's just a statement that this kind of a high-level, hour-long deal is important. But boy, any tools that we have to mobilize and how to do this art of compromise when we're talking about feeding a growing world, immigration shifts, are really, really critical. And so I think the next 14 years, as we hit that 50-50, 50% of us white, 50% people of color, the universities are in for a rough slug, and I think your insights are helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. So thanks you to our panelists, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's excellent. It's excellent.
Glad you enjoyed it. I did too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Republicans have full Senate House.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you so very much for being here. Some quick final comments, if I can have your attention. We thank the panel that just finished up an excellent program. Let's give them a good hand. So much happened that I'd almost hesitant to bring up some of the key points, but I think there are some things that I should mention. Becky Blank's speech on Sunday night was not just an excellent presentation, but really is what drives us. Public universities and their role in research and education. That speech will be on the web, but it's almost a blueprint of what we need to do. The power by public discussion that we've had, the clusters, the moral imperative, the social justice needs for all this work is known by all of you. And these 130 institutions, but virtually everybody else of our institutions are working on the same issues in their own ways. Clearly, this is going to be so important. Mr. Isaacson's speech yesterday at lunch, to me, the most impacting component of that, something I'd known, but I loved him laying it out, is how historically and presently communities that have diverse populations, diverse people, tend to be the ones that are the most creative, the most dynamic. APLU will continue to work hard on these immigration issues. I know what the panel said about DACA, but the Supreme Court is going to rule. We've got to continue to work at this. There cannot be backing off. We continue to need to think about green cards and degrees. I mean, we need this immigrant population for the creativity that the country has to have. There was some discussion here about security in connection with Chinese students, about a major research effort that focused on some of the areas we need to be very competitive about. Those are areas that APLU is deeply involved in, and we will continue to work at. I thought the race panel at the beginning of this morning's session was just outstanding. I think that, I believe, was a unanimous view here. We're going to continue to work at those things. I won't go on, but because there was so much, as I say, that I could get into. But all in all, this was just a tremendous meeting. I think I keep hearing that from all of you. The largest in number, but tremendous in substance. And as always, Jean Middleton, my chief of staff and vice president that works at planning this with her key people, There are several people throughout the year. We appreciate what she's done, and the vice presidents, the program staff that put together all this. Let me just say how much I appreciate them, and I know you do too, because they make it work with the help of the councils and commissions. So I think you're probably ready to go home. But thank you so much, and you have a good day.